Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God. I'm Abby.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Fletcher.
And today's story is about Esther.
There we go.
Got it.
All right.
Esther.
I like her.
Yeah.
She's cool.
Good girl.
Pretty
good story.
Good. Yep.
And that's why we're telling it.
That's why we're telling it. And we also have a question, which will become the connection will become apparent as we continue to talk. So, how would you like to be pampered? Is the question. Not we're not talking about the Pampers diaper.
Oh.
Nope.
I was more of a Huggies man.
We're talking about being pampered and being taken care of and
going through the works
self-care and stuff
of
like that.
personal pampering.
Yeah. How would you like to be pampered?
I don't know. All right, who wants to go first?
I was hoping you were, Abby, because you got all excited about being pampered.
No,
Yeah.
I don't really like. I don't like spa things. I don't like being touched. So anything that like.
So to be pampered, it's like you leave you alone in a quiet room. You have a book.
Honestly, more like do all the laundry, clean the house,
Yeah.
and then let me watch a movie by myself,
There you
Those
go.
are
or
forms of
like
pampering.
just sitting with Josh.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah,
Nice.
that sounds pretty. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't want a massage.
I was reminded of my favorite way to be pampered today or this weekend in talking to Rob Webb because he did this recently, but like the spa Scandinave kind of experience. So when we lived in Quebec, there was one close to us.
There's
and
one now.
they have there's a steam room, a dry sauna, hot tubs, cold tubs. There's a completely dark room. There was a natural spring and all these things that you could go in and sit in, and then rooms where you could just sit and read. And so get the massage, take advantage of all the rest and relaxation, bring a book, fall asleep. I'm all over it.
Nice.
There you go.
Love it.
See, I've just discovered a new form of pampering. I got a pedicure a couple
Okay.
weeks ago.
Okay.
I didn't hate it.
Did it look
There
like
you
Dumb
go.
and Dumber?
No, there's no painting. They tried to get me to paint my nails, and I said, no, I'm okay, thank you. But, they trimmed them all up and made them look great. But the massage, foot massage, and like a back massage,
Yeah.
that's nice.
Now, before the pedicure, did you cut your own toenails?
Yeah, of course. As opposed to what,
Right?
letting them grow?
Right? No, like letting them do all the cutting. Like I got a for our 1 year anniversary, Michelle and I went out and we got pedicures, and I was like, I better cut these before they cut them.
Oh,
because
see, it wasn't planned. It was just a off the cuff thing. So I wasn't like going, I gotta check
Right.
my toenails, otherwise they're gonna think I'm crazy.
Right. But like I know that I don't cut them the way that they do, right? And so the lady, she's doing all the stuff, and then she looks up at me and she's like, "Do you want me to?"
They were so long, they thought you were growing them out for something.
She wasn't impressed with my feet.
No.
And my feet were too big for the things that they they put them in these buckets and bags and and my feet were way too big for them
That's
as well.
funny.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, I tend to keep my toenails short because I don't like getting cut by other
You chew-
people's
you chew
toenails.
them,
Oh,
right?
right.
No, I don't. Well, not directly off my toe, but sometimes I chew them after.
Oh,
No, anyway,
that's
don't bring that up.
Disgusting.
That's
Come
not
on.
part of the pampering question. Please, let's move on.
Did we land on your pampering, Abby, as being left
Yeah.
alone, or is
Left alone
yeah?
with the laundry and stuff done.
With all the chores done.
Yeah,
That just sounds good.
Because otherwise it's just lingering. You're like, yeah, I'm relaxing,
Yeah.
but I could be doing something
Yeah,
else.
exactly. I can't relax if there's things to do.
I can, even though I just shove it further back in my mind and it's all good. My wife will attest to that.
There we go. So we'd love to hear from you. How would you love to be pampered? How would you like to be pampered? You can hit us up in the social media realm, or you can send us an email. You know where to reach us and let us know. And of course, as always, we do encourage you to read the stories for yourselves in order to get the whole picture of what is going on. And today's story, believe it or not, the story of Esther takes place in the book of Esther.
Jeremiah.
Well,
Almost, not
almost,
quite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you remember last week, we talked about Amos, who was the shepherd prophet, and he talked about Israel and its coming judgment and destruction. And since then, the kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and the people of Israel were deported there and sent throughout the Assyrian Empire, and they also brought other people into the land of like the northern kingdom and kind of dropped other people groups in there. And then the Assyrians were defeated by the Babylonians, who eventually conquered the kingdom of Judah as well and destroyed Jerusalem. And they also took people as captives. And so we read about Daniel and Ezekiel and hear about them being taken as captives. And that's in the Bible, that's known as the Babylonian captivity. But then they're actually defeated as well by the Persian Empire and a king named Cyrus, who actually sends the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild. Well, I wouldn't say he sends them; he allows them to go back, and a number of them do return and begin the rebuilding. And there's also so during that time, there's still remnants of Jews that are left throughout the Persian Empire who were exiled by both the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And that's where we find ourselves in today's story.
Right. So we're on another book named after a person. I think this is like the fourth or fifth one. It's a name. We did Ruth. We did Amos. We did Esther.
Right.
And so Esther tells the story, of course, of Esther, but it's the story about how the Jewish people started celebrating this festival called Purim, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so this genre of the book of Esther is interpreted in a couple different ways. And so by Christians, they think it's either it actually happened, it's a historical event, or it was a story that was told in a historical setting, and parts of it are fiction. Either way, these interpretations are both in the canon of the Bible. And so we're going to call Esther the Word of God because it is in our modern Bible canon. And so our interpretation of the story, whether it's historical truth or a story that we're told to learn lessons from, our interpretation isn't going to change. So going into that, we'll talk about the historical context of the book of Esther.
Yep.
And so the book is set during the reign of King Ahasuerus, who's assumed to be King Xerxes I of Persia, which would have put him around 485 to 465 BC. That was his reign. And if Xerxes is Ahasuerus, it's the same person. The timeline actually fits really well with his life. He went to war at one point, and during the third year of his reign, he went to war and he came back a little bit later, and that actually fits with the story pretty nicely. So yeah, this story probably takes place around 480, 479 BC.
Awesome. And so this story takes place in the palace of Susa, which was in the Persian Empire, which is in modern-day Iran. So it is one of the oldest settlements in the area, and it was rebuilt by Darius the Great, which later became the capital of the Persian Empire.
Susa.
Yeah.
Crazy. All right, let's get into the story of Esther. So during the third year of the reign of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, he held a feast for all his officials, and he's like, okay, I'm going to do this crazy festival. I'm going to show off my wealth to all my noblemen, all my elite people, my governors, my soldiers from around the kingdom. And they all gathered to Susa, to his palace, and he, just showed them everything he's got. And this actually lasted for 180 days of him just flexing on all his men and his officials, showing off how powerful he is. And he basically set out a decree at one point saying, look, eat and drink as much as you want. I'm not going to ask you to do anything. Go get drunk. Go do whatever the heck you want.
Insane. In 180 days of just
parading his wealth
and debauchery and
absolutely
carnality. Like it's just hedonism is
180 days
on
of
display.
hedonism. All right. So during there was the last 7 days, he's like, okay, we're going to throw this crazy feast, and it's going to be right in the king's palace. And so everybody is drinking, everybody is eating as much as they want. The king is flexing everything he's got. This is the final 7 days of this party. And on the last day, he actually asks, he says, okay, I'm going to get my wife. She's gorgeous. She's going to wear the nice crown. She's going to come, and I'm going to show her off how beautiful she is to all my officials and all my noblemen.
Which we probably should put that in air quotes. The whole show off her beauty.
Show off her beauty.
Because a lot is implied there as to what's actually happening, and the crown may in fact be the only piece of clothing that is involved. And so what does she do?
She says,
She says,
Gets a little upset.
No way.
no, I'm not going to go do that. And so what does the king do? Of course, he gets mad.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, I got to meet with my wise men, and we're going to decide what we're going to do about this, because she's not getting away with it.
Right.
So he discusses with his wise men, what are we going to do? And they say, well, if we let her get away with this now, other wives are going to think they can disobey their husbands. It's going to set a bad example for the whole kingdom, and the world's going to fall apart. And so they decide, we're going to banish Queen Vashti because she disobeyed the king. And that's exactly what he does. He goes and banishes her. Later, the wise men suggest, okay, so we got to find somebody else to replace Vashti. Let's get you a harem full of beautiful women, beautiful young women from around the palace or from around the city, to try to find a replacement. And so a harem is where the king's women lived, and his wives, his concubines, and their servants. And basically, he's like, I'm going to get the prettiest women from the entire city. I'm going to summon them to me. I'm going to test them. I'm going to see who's the best. And that's who's going to be queen.
Right.
And so at the same time this is happening, there was a woman who lived in Susa, and she was being raised by her cousin. His name was Mordecai, and he worked at the palace, so he was around the area.
Yep.
He was a Jewish man. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he'd actually been taken from Jerusalem during the captivity when the Babylonians took them.
Right.
And so this girl's name was Hadassah, which is a Jewish name, but her Persian name was Esther.
Yep.
That's where we get the name of the book.
It's true.
And says she was very beautiful. Her figure was very nice. And she's actually one of the girls that get taken into the harem of the king to be, chosen potentially to be the wife of the king and to be the new queen. And so she was given this whole beauty treatment for an entire year. That's where the pampering comes in. She was given perfumes and ointments and everything to make her all fancy, gave her makeup. And basically what would happen is the king, one by one, would take these women for a night, essentially, do whatever the king does, and then throw them out the next day and say, I'll call you if I liked you.
Right.
And so that's what happened. One after another, he brought these women in, the prettiest women in the entire country. And eventually it becomes the time for Esther to go in.
Yep.
And so Esther goes in, has her night with the king, and it turns out Esther pleased the king, and the king loved Esther more than any of the other women.
Right.
And so she is the number one draft pick for the next queen to Xerxes' king.
Yes.
And so she's brought to the king back and say, you're going to become the queen. I love you more than any of the other ones. So there's a crown put on her head, and she becomes this new queen. And so it's important to note by this point, Mordecai had kind of told Esther, don't tell anybody about your heritage. I don't want anybody to know that you're Jewish.
Right.
And this actually turns out to be a good thing later on, and we'll see why. Eventually, this guy named Haman comes to power, and he became the second most powerful man in the country. He was the king's right-hand man.
Yeah.
And he's kind of flooded with power, and he gets this super prideful kind of ego. And he's like, okay, every time I'm Haman, they should be bowing to me. So he makes this decree. Everybody who passes by him was supposed to bow on their knees. And so one day, like we said, Mordecai works at the palace. Haman's walking by, or he's getting carried. He didn't want to walk himself. And he sees this guy Mordecai, who is a Jew, and of course Jews aren't allowed to bow or kneel or worship anyone else but God.
Yep.
And so Mordecai refuses, and Haman sees this and he's furious.
Yep.
Angry. Why isn't this guy bowing? And he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and he thinks, I'm going to kill this guy Mordecai.
Yep.
I'm going to kill him. But then he's like, oh,
not just Mordecai.
I can do one better.
Yeah.
Instead of just killing Mordecai, I know none of these Jews will bow. I'm going to kill all of them in the kingdom. And so he devises this plan, goes to the king and says, listen, these Jews have laws that conflict with your laws. They don't follow the king's laws. They follow their own. I'm going to come up with this plan. I'm going to give you a ton of money. All you have to do is let me kill all the Jews. It'll be clean. I'll put money in your purse. You won't have to hear it again.
I like money.
King's
That's
in.
what he's
He's been bought.
Yeah.
He doesn't disagree with Mordecai. And he gives the king gives Mordecai his ring, Haman.
Yeah.
Gives Haman his ring, which is his sign of authority. He can stamp
Seal
the little
it,
envelope with his seal. And so Haman puts this plan into effect. They end up rolling a bunch of dice to decide what day it's going to be on. And so he sends this letter out with the day. It's like on the 12th month of the year. gonna go, you're gonna kill all the Jews, and you're gonna steal all their property. And so he sends this to every province, every kingdom, every village, that this is what you're to do on this exact day. And so this letter goes out very efficiently, sends it around the country. Of course, Mordecai hears of this. He receives a letter, and he gets a copy of it, and he reads it, and he is absolutely devastated. He's distraught. He is Jewish.
Right.
He tears his clothes. He puts on sackcloth, which we've discussed if you listen to the rest of the episodes of ours. Sackcloth basically means you're in mourning, you're suffering, and you're showing that externally by wearing this raggedy clothes that itches and is rough. And so Mordecai is sitting there in anguish outside the gates, because you're not allowed in the palace if you're not wearing proper attire. And so Esther finds out that Mordecai's, sitting outside suffering and in anguish in sackcloth, and goes, what's wrong? And so Mordecai shows her the document that was sent out, and says, listen, this is what's going on. This is the plan that Haman has to kill all the Jews. We need to do something about it. You got to go tell the king, what's going on. Go ask him to save your people. And Esther is like, well, I can't just go see the king. He has to summon me, otherwise I could die, right? And he hasn't summoned me in 30 days. I don't know what's going on with him. I don't want to mess with him, otherwise I could die.
Which is just commentary there, like, this is a marriage.
Yeah.
So
not ideal.
Not a good one, though.
Not a good one. No. And Esther is obviously terrified of this. She understands that the king can very easily kill her if she steps out of line.
The title queen means zero.
It's not like it's a Queen Elizabeth here. She doesn't have the authority.
There's zero power, zero authority.
That's right. Almost, it's all responsibility and no authority.
Yep.
So Esther's in this really hard position. What does she do? Does she risk her life to go, maybe save her people, but she's probably going to die?
Yeah.
Or does she just stay back and stay safe? And so she says, listen, I'm going to die if I do this. And Mordecai comes back, listen, maybe you're going to die. And we're actually going to read it. It's from Esther chapter 4. Mordecai's responding to Esther in chapter 4, verse 12. And it says, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews in another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this.
Zinger, right there.
Mordecai's like, listen, Esther, you're one of us. I'm your family. And if you don't do anything right now, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
Maybe God's going to use somebody else to save the rest of the Jews, but your family immediately in this city will die.
Yeah.
And maybe God has put you in this position to talk to the king just because.
Just for now.
For this time, right?
Yeah.
Just for such a time as this is the famous line in the book of Esther. And so Esther's like, okay, gather the Jews in the city and pray for me, fast for me. I'm going to go do this.
Yeah. And she says some other words that are really important. She says, if I perish, I perish. That's
she's
in God's hands.
Willing to put her neck out and risk this. If I die, I die. And so she goes to the king, knowing the risk. And he ends up, holding up his scepter, which means she's allowed to enter. And so she goes, okay. The king's like, okay, what do you need, Esther? What do you need, my queen? And she's like, well, if you love me, king, come with me to a feast.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw you this feast in your honor. And so the king's like, well, yeah, of course I'll come to this party, and you can invite Haman. And so they come to this feast. They have a nice party, and Haman's all like, oh, the queen brought me to a feast herself. She must really like me. Yeah. Of course, we know she doesn't. Yeah. And so the king's like, okay, Esther, you've thrown this feast. What now? What did you come to ask me? And she goes, well, if you love me, you'll come to another feast that I'm throwing tomorrow night. And so they go to another feast, and Haman is all excited. Oh, the queen's throwing this feast for me. And so now, second party's over. The king's like, thank you for this feast, but tell me what you want. I'll give it to you as long as it's up to half my kingdom. And she's like, just bragging. I'm so powerful, I could give you anything. Yeah. And she goes, well, king, there's this plot to kill me and my people, and I want you to stop it. And she kind of rats out Haman and goes, and this is the guy who's doing it.
Right.
He's the one trying to kill me. He's the one trying to kill my people. Would you put a stop to this killing? And so the king's like, what are you talking about? And she's like, well, I'm Jewish, and Haman has put out this decree to kill all the Jews on this specific date, and I want you to stop this.
Yeah.
And so the king is like, well, Haman, how could you? And Haman knew that Mordecai was Jewish. Haman purposefully went out and attacked the Jews. And so there was this whole plot, and the king is like, okay, well, I can't let my queen die, and I can't let that evil stand. So he puts a stop to it and actually hangs Mordecai. Oh, that was close.
Oh.
Hangs Haman on the same gallows that
He wanted to hang Mordecai
was supposed
on.
to be hanged on. And so in the end, they send out this letter because in the Persian rules, you weren't allowed to change a law that had already been sent. And so they write this other decree that the Jews were to prepare themselves and to arm themselves so that on that day they were ready and prepared and didn't let anyone hurt them.
Yeah.
And so that is what the celebration of Purim is about. It's thanking God that he put Esther in that spot for such a time as that to save his people. Mm-hmm. And so they celebrate God's working through Esther in that feast.
It's pretty cool.
So what makes Esther so unlikely? Because like it sounds she was beautiful and she had some stuff going for her. So what makes her so unlikely?
Of course. Well, yes, she's beautiful and she had stuff going for her, but that doesn't mean she was going to be called by God. Like there's a lot of beautiful people that can do a lot of things, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do the right thing. But what we do see with Esther is that she was put into this position of power, limited power, obviously, as the queen, but she had this authority, and it's the way that she used it. So even though she had this power, she still had to risk her life and step out of line of her role to ask the king for something impossible, let's say, right? Nobody was going to ask for that. Nobody was going to risk their lives just to save, a couple people, but she did, and she stepped out.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you read the story close enough, you see that Esther is actually just an object in the king's palace and in the Persian Empire, and she's a victim. She's actually a victim. Like we don't need to get as graphic as you might get to describe what's going on, but she is a victim in this story. And the fact that as a victim, she is able to stand up and use her voice makes her extremely unlikely, especially in just we know about patriarchal societies, and they existed during all of Israel's time. But what was happening in Persia was so much even more than that, where like women really were just objects, and we see that.
That's what we see with the harem, right?
And sometimes we gloss over and we kind of romanticize it, and we say, oh, it was a beauty pageant and she won. It was no beauty pageant. She was a victim, and all of those women were actually victims who were taken likely against their completely against their will
and then brought to the king to essentially sleep with them, and if they're good enough, then they can.
And so even in the midst of that, she had a voice which ended up saving her people. And I think one other thing that makes her very unlikely comes, I think, from like a Jewish standpoint of how they viewed people like Esther and Mordecai, because they were given permission to go back to Jerusalem, and they didn't. A lot of Jews didn't go back to Jerusalem because life had kind of become somewhat comfortable in the Persian Empire. They were given more rights than they had been given under other empires, and they were beginning to make lives for themselves. And so there was kind of this view that like the good Jews returned to Jerusalem, and the rest stayed where they were. And so it seems unlikely that not a good Jew would be the one who saves the people, but ultimately in the decision to stay behind, which wouldn't have been her decision, it would have been Mordecai's, but the decision to stay behind actually led to the saving of the Jewish people, which makes her very unlikely as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how does this story, the story of Esther, contribute to the rest of the fulfilling of the story of God throughout the Bible?
So, like we said, we've talked about kind of the festival of Purim, and it was basically set up to remember God's deliverance of the Jewish people. And we think of all these stories that we tell are really just markers of God's works in our history, in our lives, and how he's actually working. And so it's a great reminder for us to just try to remember what God has done for us, and to set up these markers, these stories, these celebrations, to remember what God has done for us. So we have Christmas, we know we celebrate when Jesus was born. We have Easter, right, when he died and rose again. But we don't necessarily have it for, the smaller things. Are we looking back all the time at what God has done throughout not only our lives, but the lives of Christians, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's what's really cool too, and we've talked about this before, but the fact that in the book of Esther, the word God is never used, and there's no actual reference to God, but we see him at work in the midst of all that's going on. And so I think that's an important reminder for us as well, is that he's at work even when we don't see him at work. And if we take a look back, we actually see that his handiwork is obvious, and it's on display on our lives, on the lives of other Christians, as you said, and just throughout all of Christian history, which is really cool.
And you think of, God's handiwork being in the background and not necessarily in the foreground. And we tell all these stories of God's obvious work throughout, let's say, the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. And we see, God commanded him to do this, and then so, he did it.
Right.
Great. Not all of us have that God coming to us in person to person, face to face, and saying, this is what you have to do, right? And so this story of Esther is exactly that. She's put in a situation where she has no choice but to do the right, or she has a choice and she chooses to do the right thing.
Do the right thing, yeah.
And so instead of this obvious command that we get directly from God, it's Esther's in the wild by herself, and she has to choose to do the right thing. And so that's the calling that we have from God, is not always face-to-face, mouth-to-mouth, this is what you need to do. It has to be something you're doing the right thing and stepping out in faith that God will work through that.
Do the right thing.
I was thinking of Frozen 2.
To do the right thing.
Abby knows the song. Do the next right thing. That's what you got to do.
It's for Olaf, guys. Oops, spoiler.
If you haven't seen it by now, it's too late. But do the next right thing is all that Esther was commanded to do, and that is what God used in the end.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Fun.
All right. Well, I guess that concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in.
Hope to see you next week.
Bye for now.
Bye.